Okay, now there will only be one test in this mentoring course. Now, if you fail this test, though, Mike will immediately kick you off the Zoom. But without looking at your notes, can you remember the
acronym
for developing a research proposal? Let's see if you can remember the acronym, and then if you can remember what it stands for. So there are only 5 parts, so 5 is not a terribly difficult amount to remember.
So it starts with a problem, right?
Yeah. But the problem could be that we can't remember. Yeah, it starts, it's P for problem.
I think the acronym is PROM with a B.
No, the acronym is PR MOB. PR,
MOB. Oh, yeah, sorry, MOB. Right.
MOB, that's right. PR
MOB.
Okay. Does it, Rob, are you going to take us through it? The economists remember things well. See.
I remembered part of it, but I did actually go look at my notes for the rest of it. So I just want to be honest on that part. But problem is the P, the R is research questions, M is for methods, and O is for outline, and B is for the bibliography. So I presume we could have actually just thought through that process and done it too, which is what we should have done.
So just, can I just remind you about this now? You know, sadly, this method is not infallible, so I look forward to it being developed in better ways. But I think, you know, whenever you are working with a student towards a proposal, I have this fixed in my head, not the acronym, but the process. But I think the acronym is worth remembering, just PR MOB, PR MOB. Okay, but I think if you understand it, you won't need to remember the acronym. So just remember that what I'm arguing for is that when a student comes with an idea of what they want to work in, that needs to be turned into a problem calling for research. And the problem, in my opinion, is very important because it functions as the compass for the research. So you will invariably, I mean, this will happen, that students will get into the fog. They'll tell you there's so many rabbit holes. I don't know which to close off with footnotes. I don't know which to go down. And then what you say to them is, go back to your compass. It gives you the direction. And then you can see whether this rabbit hole is germane to the or peripheral to the problem. So you can take, and you know, we said last week, you can do this with undergraduates, you can do this at every level. I think it's a very useful thing. Now, just a reminder as well, you know, what you want is the student to be able to explain the problem in a few minutes, okay? Eventually, they'll be amazed that they couldn't do that straight away. There's always the possibility during research to return to your problem and refine it. Okay, so we're not setting the problem in concrete, but it is the compass for all the research because that's the problem that the research is designed to solve. Okay, now then emerging out of that are the 5 or 6 or 4 massive big research questions. That's the R. So what you say to yourself is, you know, what are the 5 or so big research questions, not astrophysics, they're ones that are staring you in the face. If I answered these 5 or so questions, I would solve this problem. So that's research questions. Now then it follows entirely logically, in my opinion. You then ask the question, okay, well, what method or methods am I going to use to answer these research questions? Okay, so that can be exegesis, opening up a dialogue with 2 theologians. You know, I think what we said last year, certainly for the Kirby Lang Center, we're not going to specialize in qualitative research with questionnaires and all that kind of stuff. I mean, unless there's someone who really has expertise in that area. But this is, so these are methods, you know, exegesis, dialogue, and so on and so forth, different ways of, in New Testament, you know, you could be saying, I think Robbie has a particular interest in this, you could be applying a discourse analysis to a text. So that would come under method as well. Okay, and then if that has been done properly, in my experience, the outline, which is the O in MOB, will more or less emerge organically for the dissertation. And the reason for that is that, you know, the dissertation, I ask my students to imagine that you're taking the reader on a journey. And if ever you've traveled by train in the UK, it's always good to check that you're on the right train. Okay, so you don't want to land up in Edinburgh when you're trying to get to Paddington, for example. So when people get on the train, you explain, you know, this is where this is what this train is about, this is where it's going, and we'll stop at blah, 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 and in 2 hours' time, whatever, we'll arrive where we're going. So the outline, I think, will more or less follow organically from the method. And then the B is just a reminder of an indicative bibliography that I haven't built into my process what some programs do, which is the required literature review. But of course, you've got to be familiar with the literature, you know, so we'll come to that. So indicative bibliography is a sign that I know the literature, that my project hasn't been done already and successfully and definitively resolved. So you're not reinventing the wheel and so on and so forth. Okay, so can I just ask you, this does feel like I'm in the classroom again, but can I just ask you to stop and make sure you've got PR MOB, because I'm going to ask you next week as well, and be terrible if you fail next week too. Okay. All right, so you've got the outline, I think, for today, and so we will just keep going through it. So a student has applied, they've been accepted, you are the primary supervisor, and so you have your first Zoom with them. This won't be the first time you've met them, so they're all excited now. But now, what do they do to get going? Okay, so this is a really, really important time, because we have to help the student to really embark on this research journey that is going to culminate in a 90,000 word dissertation, which will be examined, hopefully successfully. So that's the end goal, but they have to start where they are. So this is what I propose, and then others of you, you're very welcome to chip in, please, anything you can do to help us with best practice. So what I would propose is for the first few months, if you're full-time, maybe the first 3 months, if you're part-time, maybe the first 6 months, is to do some work exploring the proposed topic to confirm or not that it is a viable research topic and that it is what the student really wants to work on. Okay, so I would say in the first few months, exploratory work. Now, what does that look like? Well, let me just tell you what I do with my students. The one thing I do is I get them writing straight away. Okay, so in my opinion, if you have a student who wants to meet with you regularly, just to chat about their research, but never delivers writing, you've got a problem. Okay, so from the get-go, you arrange with the student, no writing, maybe no meeting, I don't know. But you know, it's not, and I have had students like this. I've had students who wanted to fly over from America, visit with me several times to discuss their research, but no writing is ever repeated. And eventually they fall off the program. So it's very, very important to get the student writing straight away. And what I do is I get them to begin, say for example, they're working on a topic and a major book has been published on that topic recently. I will suggest to them that they do a review of the book as their first piece of writing. Now, what I would do, say to them, is that review should not be much longer than 5,000 words. So what we don't want, is 30,000 coming in straight away, but nor do we want just 1,000. So we want about 5,000 words coming in as a good book review. And what I would say to them, 2/3 of that review can explain the argument of the book. But in 1/3 of the review, they are to engage with the argument critically. Okay, so, and you'll immediately realize there's a whole lot of things starting to go on here. So we're getting them into the tradition of the topic. So, the good news and the bad news for a doctoral student is the discussion doesn't begin when they arrive. The discussion has probably been going on for 3,000 years or something like that. So they've got to become familiar with the discussion. They've got to find a way into it, which is what you're helping them to do. They've got to be able to explain descriptively in their own words the argument of a major scholar in the area. And then we want them to begin thinking critically about this, giving reasons for their critique of the author that they're reading. Okay, or at the very least, and this I would encourage students to do, is to make a list of the questions that emerge from their engagement with this author. In other words, because that is what starts to open up future research paths. So you want, those things going on. And this will immediately tell you, can the student write? Hopefully, if you remember our discussions last time, we already know that. But you can attend straight away to writing style, to academic style, to their capacity to explain the argument of a major thinker in the area, and then also their ability to think critically about it. And then, if they're thinking about what other questions emerge, then other research areas start to open up. And so what I would encourage us to do is to tell students that they don't submit writing to you without proper academic style and a full bibliography. Because what we're encouraging them to do is the minute they start work, they must keep a full bibliography of everything they've read in proper academic style. And I think all of us know from publishing, we get to the point of the galleys or the final proofs, and there's 4 sources that we just can't find anywhere, and we can't remember. And with a doctoral project, it's 3 years work or 6 or 7 years work. And it's often hard to remember, where you were 3 years ago and what sources you were using. So this is tremendously important. Okay, and then, one would work organically with the student from there. So it may just appear from their book review, okay, this big topic has emerged. So, I will review another book, or I'll write 5,000 words on a certain piece, part of this argument that has emerged, or something like that. But I would generally say to the student, let's get 3 or so short pieces under the belt before we begin to actually work on a chapter. However, this work, in all likelihood, will feed into those chapters. So you're not asking students to do work that will be a waste of time. The other thing that you're wanting from these excavations in the area is to confirm for the student and yourself that the topic is viable and doable. Okay, you'll check that the research has not already been done. So there is room for originality in this research. And in the process, between their indicative bibliography and this, they'll be circling around the literature and the topic and doing something of a literature review, not necessarily in writing, but in practice. Okay. And then generally, what I would say is there are times when students will ask to meet with a supervisor just to have a discussion. Okay, Michael, I'll come to you in a moment. But generally, the idea is that you meet with a student after writing has been submitted. Now, ideally, you would meet with them, I would say, within 2 weeks of submitting a piece of writing. You don't want to delay that. And you know, we need to remember the experience of the student. They've slaved away at this, hopefully. They finally got it to you and they can't wait to know what you're thinking. So what I would do is try and acknowledge that I've received it. You say to them, well done. And then schedule a meeting so they know when you're going to be meeting with them. And my general practice is to keep a supervision to an hour. So this is something I learned from my sociologist and psychologist friends. No one ever taught me this at seminary, that it's really not good to be scheduling 3-hour appointments. Okay, and there will be students who would absolutely love to talk to you every day and to run everything past you and so on and so forth. If you choose to do that, just remember that's your choice. But generally an hour should be perfectly adequate to deal with a piece of research and what the next stages are. Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, what would be the signs as a supervisor that you're looking for that a project is not feasible? What would be the flags that would alert that?
Well, just bear in mind, because of our process, a lot of work will have been done helping the student with the proposal. So there's already background work that is being done. So they're not going to be coming to you with no background work being done. But I think if you know, or if in the course of doing the research, they discover that, you know, 4 doctorates have been written precisely on this area, and it's not looking like there's a lot of new light to be shed. I mean, you know, they can argue, look, they have a whole different take potentially on a topic. Well, then that's okay. But I mean, if they, and then the other thing I think to watch is that this really is bringing the student alive. So that you know, because they've got to have enough passion that will carry them over 3 years or 6 years, you know. So I think, you know, those are the sort of things to have a look for. Does anyone else have any comments? Mike, yeah.
Yeah, I think this question is related to Michael's, and it's how do you handle it when the writing is good, but the student can't articulate it in the meeting? You know, like the speaking part isn't, you know, it's like what I'm doing right now, you know, stumbling over myself, and yet the writing is very good, right? How would you think about that?
You know, so I do think, you know, one of the gifts we can bring to our students, and maybe Mike, you and me can work on this, sort of, what are the sort of giftings that you hope will emerge from the doctoral process? Now, one thing to remember is in the final examination and in the upgrade, the student will have to defend the thesis. So, and you know, part of the report that the examiners write is how the defense went. So I think, you know, if you find that the student's writing is excellent, but their oral articulation of the work is not great, then I think you know, very gently and courteously you alert the student to that, and you make that something that you work on with them and that they work on. You know, so there does have to be, I mean, this is a written dissertation, but whenever it's examined, it will be examined orally. And then they will have to articulate and to be able to defend the thesis. So that is an important issue.
Yeah, because I raise the question because I've examined theses that have been written wonderfully, and then you get to the defense and you wonder who this person is sitting across the table. They can't say a word about what they've written, supposedly. So I wondered if there was a way to incorporate into the supervision a kind of training or a kind of, you know, experimentation with how to do this. If students, for some students, this might be their first time, you know, standing on their own 2 feet.
Okay, and to go back to PR mob, I think you can build it in. So once the research proposal, you know, after the excavations, you would return to the research proposal, see if they want to revise it or if they're happy with it. But the kind of thing I would do in a supervision is to say to the student, now explain to me the problem you're investigating in 3 to 5 minutes. And if they can't do it, then I would say to them, you have to practice this. You know, practice it with your wife or your husband or your colleagues or your friends. But you have to be able to explain very succinctly and very clearly the problem that you're going to investigate. You know, so I think from very early on, I think you can build it in, and certainly in the supervision, you know, the supervisor must be the sort of person who asks questions. So we must not think of the supervisor just as someone who gives answers. So one of the things, you know, when you get a piece of writing, you know, you can say to the student, you know, what exactly did you mean here? And so give them lots of opportunity in the supervision to be, in a very nice way, on the spot and having to explain their work. You know, so, yeah, it's really important, I think, to remember that this is the student's research. It's not the supervisor's research. So, you know, the supervisor is there as an expert guide, but a guide, not to do the research for the student, you know, so. Okay, anyone else have any comments in those areas?
Yes,
Yeah.
I may. Getting back to Michael's question about the viability of a proposal or a problem. I think one of the marks or one of the tests of this would be what is the scope of the research problem that the person is trying to endeavor to answer. If it's too wide, if it's too diffuse, then there's a lot of work to be done on it in order to concentrate. I mean, we've talked about this before, haven't we? To concentrate it down into something which is really manageable even in 3 years, or manageable over 6 years if it's part-time. So I think if the student is trying to do too much or to answer too many questions, then something has to be said to that person about actually focusing more on the intrinsic problem, the intrinsic question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Andrew. That's very, very good. And, you know, and I would think then you return to the compass, you know, because there's something wrong there. The other thing is what's manageable for a full-time student in 3 years will be different to what's manageable for a part-time student possibly in 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I think with part-time students, the focus and the capacity to do it is even more important. because they've got a lot of other things going on in their lives. So it's got to be doable, you know, within the time constraints they have available. If the person has the freedom for, you know, 3 or 4 years full time, and they spend 6 months wandering in the fog, it's not the end of the world. But if you're part-time, that's not a good experience, you know. So, and I would also say one thing to do is if you think there may be a problem with it being too diffuse, that's where this community is very helpful. Just quietly run it past one of us and say, what do you think? You know, so you know, that's where we can help one another, I think.
Greg, can I just add in something there? Just going back to helping the student get started and with the writing, one thing that you said to me, in addition to the, you know, review a major book idea, something you said to me that I've said to master's thesis students that seems to be really helpful is like, make a little foray into your outline. And it doesn't really so much matter where, but wade in somewhere and kind of see what happened. And for me, not feeling the panic of like, I've got to start at the method and like hammer that and then move to like breaking out of the linearity and being like, I'm just going to wade into, like I spent 6 weeks working on Ecclesiastes, which was enough to figure out I was not going to do anything with Ecclesiastes in the dissertation, and that most of it was going to be in Deuteronomy, right? And that was how I was able to break out of this proposal that was way too big. So just as another framing for kind of an initial exercise, that was helpful for me and has been helpful for some students I'm working with at the master's level.
Yeah, Michael, thank you for that. I mean, it was such a sad moment when you abandoned Ecclesiastes, but what can we say? But you know, so Michael actually has brought some important light at this point, which I'm grateful for. The idea of these initial things, I call them excavations, because it's like drilling around the research proposal and in it to see if the oil that you think is there is actually there. Okay, so in other words, and you know, really what you want to say to the student is things like, what's exciting you most at the moment? Okay, now we hope it's not sports or something else like that. We mean about our research, you know, or the trip to New Zealand that is coming up. But, you know, what's exciting you most at the moment? Okay, do a bit of an excavation there, do a bit over there. And Michael's absolutely right. The one thing we want to discourage the student from is just thinking about the research as linear. So in my opinion, the most obvious time to write the introductory chapter is at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so, and then also, you know, when you think of the upgrade, you want a chapter that shows some of the meat and potatoes, if I can say so, of the dissertation. So having an upgrade chapter which is sort of beginning and purely descriptive may not be the best for the upgrade. So the you know, different students will work in different ways. Now, of course, there is a linearity to the to the dissertation, and there has to be. But that doesn't mean, you know, you've got to go into, you know, 40,000 words on method and so on and so forth. And so the thing can evolve organically to an extent. Okay, these are very helpful comments. So, and then, you know, what should emerge from these excavations as confirmation or not of the proposed research area. So Michael has just said, for example, he spent 6 weeks in his work on feasting and ethics in Ecclesiastes, decided it's not going to be it, so then he went for Deuteronomy. So those are the kinds of things that can happen in this period, but the excavatory work, not definitive work, but sinking a hole just to make sure there is oil there and that it's worth pursuing it. That's what we're talking about. Okay, now then the other thing that we'll need to be conscious of, if you're working on a biblical book, for example, or possibly in theology or some areas, there is going to be a lot of literature on many topics in German and French. Now, increasingly, of course, there's also, we're aware of the global church, so, you know, other languages become useful. But I just wanted to put a caveat in here. So you do, you know, I have 2 students at the moment who are both working on Gerhardus Voss, who's receiving quite a lot of new attention at the moment. So with both of those students, I've said to them, look, you are going to need to learn Dutch. Okay. And I've also said to them, the doctoral research is not your magnum opus, it's the beginning. And if you learn Dutch well, that opens up huge opportunities for future research, for future translation, and so on and so forth. Now, you know, in my own experience, many of us have suffered through trying to add a language in what I think is an almost disastrous way. And that is the 6-week summer reading course in French or German. Now, it is possible that that really works for some students. I massively discourage my students from going down that route. Okay, so what I would think is that a goal for a student would be to add one modern language irreversibly to their toolkit over the course of doing the doctorate. That's what I would propose. We may get some students who are just language mad and can just keep adding languages. There are people like that, but for most doctoral students, they do need foreign languages, perhaps in their area. And then I would say something like German, you know, slow and steady for 3 years or 6 years, if possible, a time of immersion in a German-speaking context. And then you emerge at the end of your doctorate with German irreversibly part of your toolkit. So I don't know if any others of you have comments to make in this area.
Only to say, Craig, I think it depends very much on what your research focus is. It may well be that you can do a splendid PhD without learning either German or French, depending on, you know, perhaps you're doing research on somebody who's writing in another language. And most of what they have written has not been translated into English, for example. So, you know, it's absolutely necessary that you learn that language. German, I mean, if you're doing research on Paul Ricoeur, for example, then French would be your language, I would guess. But if you're doing it on a German, you know, some kind of German input, then German would be. But as you rightly say, you know, the research could be on any element which people are writing on within the context of the world church.
Yeah, so this is something that will vary from topic to topic. And, you know, so just for example, you know, I'm thinking of Old Testament studies in particular. And so when, you know, I was working on Ecclesiastes, Gordon Wenham would say to me, you have to have read everything that was written in the last 25 years. Well, a lot of that was written in French and German in particular. Okay, so now, of course, if with Old Testament, you know, there's Hebrew, there's other cognate languages and so on and so forth. So linguistic requirements for certain areas are very demanding. But I think in principle, especially for us English-speaking folks, it's a good idea if we can to acquire another language, you know. But this is something that the thing that I would want to flag with my students is please don't go and do the 6-week course, you know, that a lot of seminaries and other organizations offer. and it bypasses speaking the language. It tries to get you as fast as possible just to reading it. And you end up, when you're actually reading, with your dictionary right next to you and almost looking up every word, and you've still got to make, you know, how does this fit together? So I think my argument would be, the principle is, let's go for doing another language. There are lots of great ways to learn languages nowadays, but slow and steady, so that when you come to the end, it's irreversibly part of your toolkit, is what I would argue for.
It is possible, I suppose, that a person comes to their research already having a language, and that actually might well indicate what their research project is going to be about.
Yeah, and we have, I think,
yes, sorry, go on.
No, carry on.
No, I've finished.
Okay. Yeah, you know, I don't know if this student has applied, but we have someone like that who doesn't feel they could do the biblical languages, but does have access to Spanish. And so then, you know, in my preliminary discussions with them and another friend of theirs, we talked about how they could shape up the dissertation that plays to their linguistic strengths, you know? So I think, especially for a part-time student, they're not, you know, they're not going to have the bandwidth maybe to do a lot of extra work in the language area. So yeah. And then we talked last time, for those of us who are fluent, like Andrew in Spanish or others in other areas, or Norwegian, we want to know from Mikhail and other people like that, what's being published in Norwegian that we need to know about. You know, I mean, these are just incredible gifts. If we have someone in other cultures who can just be flagging, you know, this isn't in English, but I've seen it in Norwegian. And I know, for example, when I visited the Netherlands, you know, I mean, I always go to bookstores and so on. You know, I've been able to pick up stuff that I just wouldn't know about if I wasn't in a country like that. So the more we can circulate into our community, and especially once we become aware that we've got the following doctoral students working on the following areas, then we can all be looking out and saying, oh, you know, just flagging, I came across this, and then I think it becomes enormously rich. You know? So I'm sure, for example, as Michael and his family go to New Zealand, because I know this as part of the Southern Hemisphere, that there's a whole lot of literature that we just aren't aware of in the North. You know, I also know that the pond between the UK and America is just enormous. So one of the gifts we can bring is to start bridging some of these different contexts so that, yeah, okay. All right, and then, so moving on, you know, having done the excavations, one would encourage the student to do a revision of the proposal. And just one thing with the title of a dissertation, you know, we all love literary titles with allusivity and all sorts of things. That is not what you want for a dissertation title. Here I'm with the publishers. The title must tell the reader what the dissertation is about. So this is very important that, you know, when the examiner picks up the dissertation, probably the first thing they'll read is the title, and the second thing they'll read is the abstract. Now, the abstract is another thing that's difficult to write well and needs to be written at the end, but it's very likely that an examiner will focus in on those two things, first of all, often circling back to the abstract. So we don't want a wonderful elusive title. We want a title that tells the reader exactly what the dissertation is about. Okay. And then, of course, this would be a time also to assess that the supervisory team has got the requisite skills to supervise the research. And sometimes one has to add a person to a supervisory team because of the way a doctorate develops. So I had someone, for example, working on theology of language, and he had a former professor from his master's in linguistics who was very willing to be part of the team. That turned out to be an absolute gift, because he would go and visit his former professor, who would just give him boxes of articles. So nowadays you just hand over the disk or whatever, but you've got to make sure that in a reasonable way, that the skills necessary to supervise the dissertation are present in the supervisory team. Okay, and then I think the student is in a position to start researching and writing individual chapters or parts thereof. So, one can say to the student, okay, this is a long chapter, it's going to be about 20,000 words. So why don't you write the first half, which is 10,000, send that to me, we'll meet, we'll discuss it. And then you can move on to the second half, or so on and so forth. So, but then the student can start digging in. And, what I tell my students, I don't always pull this off, but that ideally, when one is heading up to the upgrade, one wants to have 2 chapters in hand. Okay, so that's the kind of goal that I set. And then what you do for the upgrade is you take 1 chapter and you polish that thing until it's an immaculate shape at a clearly doctoral level. And then that is the chapter that is submitted for the upgrade. Okay, so, and that is a really important process.
Craig?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is everyone on the call familiar with the upgrade in the British system?
Oh, no. So Michael, do you want to explain? And I'm not 100% aware of how UTC does this, so please explain it to us.
Yeah, and I don't have the UTC document right in front of me, but I did look at it recently. It's the same that I went through. Michael, I think you went through it as well. Dave, you would have gone through it. So when a student starts the British PhD, they're in the PhD program, but they're like at an MPhil level, and it's a kind of temporary spot to see over the course of 1 full year of study, are they going to be able to do this? And like Craig says, you do all of the work you would normally do. They get a chapter polished and ready to submit. And then you submit that and you have like a mini exam where you defend that chapter to see if you have demonstrated in the writing, as well as how you articulate the project, if you're capable of actually finishing the program. And that's when you sort of upgrade to full PhD student status, and you finish your dissertation, and then you have your defense at the end. So I think of it as 1 year full-time in, you have a mini defense of 1 chapter. And then if you sustain that exam, then you finish the program. Is that good, Craig?
Yeah, no, that's superb. So this is like a mini Viva. So, I don't have the UTC requirements in front of me, but normally at British universities, there's an external examiner and an internal. And what this, at its best, so Rob, I'll come to you now, at its best, this becomes a very creative opportunity. I've never been sad that my students have had to go through this. When I did my doctorate, I was able to avoid it, which I was very glad to avoid. But actually for my students, it's really good, because that 1 chapter, I have some students heading towards that at the moment. And the number of meetings I have with them increases. They know, as Michael will remember, that I start becoming far more anal as a supervisor, worrying about things like periods and full stops and commas and double spaces and the logic of the argument. And so the focus becomes very intense to polish one chapter into immaculate shape, clearly at a doctoral level, and to revise the outline for the project. And then all of that is discussed in this meeting. And at its best, these external people and the internal are really helpful. So I had one student, some of you will know, who was working on Augustine and wisdom. And we didn't know whether to broaden the project towards wisdom or to narrow it towards Augustine. And Oliver O'Donovan was the external for the upgrade. He nearly gave this person a heart attack because halfway through it, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out Augustine's commentary on the Psalter in Latin. Okay, so you have your moments in these things, but Oliver encouraged us to keep the focus very closely on Augustine and to bring onto the supervisory team a world-class Augustine expert, which we did. So these are very helpful.
Craig,
Rob,
sorry,
yeah, Rob,
Craig.
and then Mike.
No, sorry, Craig, before we go to Robert, Michael McClenahan, did you want to say something about this? I saw you unmuted.
All I was going to say is that I think it's around 6,000 words we're looking for, so it may not be a full chapter.
Okay.
And it'll be 2 internal academics. I don't think we normally use an external at Union, although that may change depending on the project. And as Craig said, it's very often focused on the project plan, the question that's being looked at and the breadth of it and the appropriateness of it. And they're typically not subject matter experts, they're academics who want to be persuaded that this project is doable and the student can do it.
Okay, I know, thank you, that's very helpful.
And they do have a conversation with the supervisor on his or her own, and also with the student on their own, just to make sure that everything's going according to plan.
Okay, wonderful, yeah. Rob.
So my question was really quick. In the States, it feels like this is about going to an ABD. Can anybody confirm or deny that? I mean, it feels like, you know, I went through a proposal process and of basically the first chapter, it had this evaluation, and after that, you have sort of this ABD status. It feels like just the same, but I was just curious if there was any distinction that anybody.
Yeah, Robert, I often think in North America, this is like the comprehensive exam. It's just that it's an oral exam rather than a written exam.
Yeah, and it's not comprehensive. It's focused on the 6,000 words in the outline. Michael, can you clarify this, or should we ask Karen? What happens if the student fails this upgrade?
Yeah, you'll find the specifics in the handbook around supervision. Basically, it's going to be in the hands of the faculty once they get the report from the examiners. So it may well be a dead end. You know, they may report that they don't have confidence the student could finish, and therefore they won't be transferred. They may get another chance to come back. Mm-hmm. It is important to note it's not a I don't know the American system at this point, but it's certainly not a tick box exercise. I mean, you really can fail it. You know, the student really has to demonstrate that they're at PhD level.
Okay, so yeah, so you know, in some British universities, as Michael indicated, you register initially for MPhil PhD, which I don't think is the case at UTC, is it? No, okay. And then if you don't pass the upgrade, you would continue at the MPhil level. But I think what Michael has said is very important. This doesn't mean we start the student at a lower level than the doctoral level. The minute you start working with them, there's the project, you get going on the whole thing. And then this Viva, we call it, is one chapter polished into absolutely immaculate shape. And with a revised outline for the proposal. And then this is scrutinized to confirm with the student that this is viable. And once it's a very, very useful ritual. because they now know what they've got to produce to finish the doctorate. So that's where this is so valuable. So, yeah. Okay. So just, things, the kind of things that I say to my students is, there's one thing I find almost intolerable in this process, and that's the student who specializes in lastminute.com. Okay, so I've had two, historically, I've had two students who have specialized in lastminute.com. The one just got through the upgrade because the oral presentation was so good. The other one forgot to put a key source in his bibliography, had it in his briefcase, which he pulled out, but the examiners were not impressed. So he was asked to redo the upgrade. So lastminute.com doesn't work. So we just move through these things. So just you have a note on the outline that the introduction, I think, is generally something to worry about at the end of the dissertation, because then you can write it well, knowing the journey that you're introducing the reader to. And then probably with time, we'll come up with a long list, if we wanted to, of stylistic issues to watch out for. So in my opinion, it's not wrong to use the first person, but I don't generally encourage an excessive use of the first person. So one can vary it to words like the second person, plural we, or other ways of stating it. But Ecclesiastes has an excessive use of the first person, which is part of its message, I think. And we don't necessarily want to translate that into dissertations. And then we spoke last time in terms of a style to aim at. And this is something Gordon Wenham said to me, which I found helpful throughout my career. He said to me at one point, Craig, if you can say it simply and clearly, say it simply and clearly. And that was tremendous advice, which I remain enormously grateful for. And then another thing just to watch out for is we're now in an age, and this affects all of us, where a lot of the resources we have access to are electronic. So something at some point, and maybe we need to do this communally, is just to have discussions about taking notes. But of course, the danger with electronic is the possibility of copying and pasting and then forgetting that you've copied and pasted. So that is something just to be flagging all the time, that we all need to be conscious of that. And so to be using our sources well, but not just using sections without acknowledgement. Then just another thing, and some of you may have good things to add in this list. So just a few weeks ago, I was working with a student, and a lot of my students do what I consider very interesting projects. So multiple disciplines are coming into play. And this was just with a student working on Gerhardus Voss. And Gerhardus Voss, like Abram Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, uses organic a lot, the word organic. And I think it's true that in Voss's work, organic is what I would call a root metaphor for his scholarship. Okay. Now, there are multiple things that enter into the discussion at a point like this. Bavinck, Kuyper, and Voss lived at a time when the organic was very popular in a whole host of academic disciplines. Okay. Now, what my doctoral student and I seem to have discovered is that people who've written on this and Bavinck haven't known much about how metaphor works. Okay. And if you do know, and I taught philosophy of language, and this is an area of my interest, that in about the last 30 years, there's been a sheer explosion of work on what is called cognitive metaphor. And the great luminaries in this area are Lakoff and Johnson. Okay, so, you know, here I have a student working on Gerhardus Voss. I don't want him to write a doctorate on the organic metaphor, and I don't want him to go and write a doctorate on metaphor. But I do want him to show that he really is aware of how this organic emphasis emerged in Romanticism and so on and so forth. And I also want to know him to know enough about theory of metaphor so he can make an original contribution to a discussion in which metaphor has not been taken sufficiently seriously. Okay, so he would say to me a question like, okay, well, you know, what literature do I go to? So I did a very simple thing with him. You know, we just went immediately, and this is, I don't know what you do, but this is one of the things I do. I just opened Google Books and I did a search on organicism. And immediately, you know, about 7 or 8 books start to come up about, you know, which give you some starting point. And then they're going to be footnotes and other things if you want to pursue it. And then, you know, we had a discussion, and I still don't know the answer to this. If you do, please tell me, because it will help me and my student. Where does the notion of a root metaphor come from? So in a lot of discussion about metaphor, you have the root metaphor and you have the surface metaphors. Now, in my research, there's only one scholar I've been able to track root metaphor down, and that is an older book by a guy called Pepper. But as far as we can work out, he doesn't discuss surface metaphors. Okay, but these, you know, nowadays we have the tools, and these are things to get your students, you know, to best practice as quickly as possible. This was such a simple thing, but my student hadn't thought of doing that. So in the supervision, we quickly did that. We found some sources there, then he can go and explore and so on and so forth. So finding sources and encouraging students to develop a curious nature, always pushing the boundaries, okay? So all our research is in one sense interdisciplinary. And sometimes the major breakthroughs will be coming by noticing where other disciplines are manifesting in our work. So I can remember at the University of Gloucestershire that once we started the Scripture and Hermeneutics seminar, and we held an international seminar for 9 years, somewhere in the world each year with the top scholars in that area. We published each year a volume, 8-volume series. You could literally see the type of doctorates being done in our department changing. The hermeneutical dimension became much stronger. The philosophy of language dimension became much stronger. And so this is something just to be aware of, especially in a community like we are. You know, if you come across something like metaphor, which you're going to come across all over the place, by the way, you know, and you think, gee, I don't know anything about that. So what I did with my students said, look, the starting point is Dan Stiver's book on philosophy of religious language, which is a superb introductory textbook that Kevin Van Hooser told me about. And then Dan Stiver came to one of our consultations. So these are just, you know, it's creating the links and helping students to know where to go and look. And then what happens is they come back and they work in their supervisions in ways that starts enhancing our own work. And that's truly good news, because then we are learning, they are learning, and the projects are opening up and unfolding. Okay, then we've talked about this just a little bit towards the upgrade. So in my opinion, there are 2 times in the dissertation where the supervisor really has to pay very close attention. The one is when you're heading into the upgrade, and the other is when you're heading into final submission. So that those I know in my supervision that a lot of more work is going to be required of me at those points, because so for the upgrade, and you know, a friend of mine said when he submitted his doctorate, his aim was to have it in such good shape that it could not be failed. And that's not a bad approach to have, rather than an approach of, you know, how can I somehow push this over the finishing line. So, and with the upgrade chapter, that chapter has to be, you know, I tell my students, whatever you do, don't default on academic style or spelling mistakes or bibliographic errors. You know, that is just stupid. I mean, that's the fool doing research. Those things you have no excuse to get into perfect shape. And then on top of that, you know, you build your argument and the other dimensions enter in. But to default because it's full of spelling mistakes or the bibliography is incomplete or the academic style varies, this is just unacceptable. So, but you have to pay attention as a supervisor at those. And incidentally, what my students generally tell me, Michael Rhodes might want to comment, I don't know. But these are the times when the process becomes very formative. So you can actually see the thinking and because you're pushing the student, you know, virtually going through sentence of the part that's going to be submitted by sentence. How does the logic develop? How does the argument develop? Is there repetition? Can you prune the repetition? You know, is the argument crystal clear? Is it strong? I mean, all these things start to enter in, and it's very, very formative. So in some cases, you can actually see the formation start to take place with the student, which is great news. And then just a reminder that there are, as I say later in this outline, the student has to watch the clock. Okay, so it's the student's responsibility to know that they have to do the upgrade by a certain point. They have to submit the doctorate by a certain point. Okay, and this is something, so once the date for the upgrade is arranged through UTC, you work backwards. Okay, so, you know, I hope it goes without saying, you don't submit the chapter or the 6,000 words the day before the upgrade. You know, in the regulations, there'll be how long you have to submit it before. And then, of course, it needs to be ready to be submitted by that time. So the student has to keep in dialogue with the supervisor, very close watch on these areas. And then, in my opinion, you avoid at all costs lastminute.com. And I think nowadays, if I had a student who tried on me the lastminute.com, I think, which I may be heading into at the moment, I would just say, you know, I just cannot do it. You know, because my work at the moment, there's just too many demands on me. I can't clear, you know, 2 hours every 3 days or something to get you through lastminute.com. You've known about this for ages and ages, and then we see, you know, let the chips fall where they fall. But so you know, the student has got to plan ahead, make sure that chapter is in immaculate shape, or those 6,000 words. Okay, and then just what I find myself is with the research proposal, when I'm working with a student on a research proposal, it normally goes through at least 4 edits before I say to them, I think this is ready to go. With the chapter for submission, it's about the same. It normally goes through about 4 edits from me before I say to them, yes, I think. So you can see the intensity accelerates, and so does the formative process. So yeah, but of course there has to be adequate time for that. And then it's not a chapter, it's 6,000 words. And then we've already spoken, ideally, the upgrade is a very valuable experience. So ideally, the students end up having a great conversation with the examiners about the project. And sometimes it's just those extra eyes that are illuminating for the research project. So that's the ideal situation that one wants to aim at. Okay, and then just you'll see in the regulations, but this might be new to the Americans, these British vivas are very, very strange things. So just so that you know, my general practice, I'm not sure what UTC's practice is on this, but my general practice is I don't attend the vivas. Okay, so if as the supervisor, you're allowed to and you do attend them, generally you may not say anything. Okay, so the British system is really bizarre because you end up as the student with 2 other people and maybe a chairperson, and the final examination is very similar. So this is unlike anything they've probably experienced before, where they've been part of a cohort and you all go and do your exams together and so on and so forth. Now it's you by yourself in a little room or virtually with these 2 or 3 other people. Okay, so that is something we have to try and prepare people for. And just you'll see in the regulations that the supervisors play the major role in selecting the examiners. And so in dialogue with the student. And just one thing I just want to alert you to, what one is looking for is good examiners who know the area well and who are decent, just people. Let me just repeat that. Good examiners who know the area well and who are decent, just people. And what I encourage my doctoral students to do, if they come to me saying, I think so-and-so would be a great examiner, I say to them, do you know anyone else who's been examined by that person? Just have a quiet word. Now, and the reason I tell you this, one thing we learned at the University of Gloucestershire, and another thing we've learned through bitter experience from some of my friends, there are prestigious academics out there who take great joy in making the exam as difficult as possible, or even failing the student. So there's one prestigious university in America that I heard of where the supervisors would take great fun in phoning the candidate a week before the exam and saying to them, I think you're going to fail. So we need to do our homework. Now, we're not looking for the easy pass. I mean, that's not the goal of this at all. What we're looking for is justice in the examination. But please don't think, oh, there's this phenomenal scholar. I don't know this person. I don't know their character. I don't know their reputation, but we'll just get them. And oh, fabulous, we've got them. And one needs to do a little bit more work in terms of that the person is good, that they know the area, they're a decent human being, and they will do justice in the examination. So it is, academics are as broken as any other profession, and we do need to be conscious of that. Okay, then supervisions, I've said this already, generally keep it to 1 hour. Now, what I do want to recommend to you is that when you have a supervision with a student, you keep a short record of it. Okay, now this is my book in which I keep my record of my supervisions with students. They're like cards that come in a thing like this. Okay, and I don't, please don't get me wrong, you probably couldn't understand them if you saw them, because it's got my squiggly handwriting on it. Some of you may do it on computer. They're not detailed at all, but I have about 6 doctoral students at the moment. I also have a ton of other stuff going on. And what I like to do is, before I have a supervision, just check their card, see what we discussed last time, and then I'm back in the conversation again. And then also just to protect ourselves. So at some point in this program, things will go wrong. And then a student will lodge a complaint or something will happen, and they will say, you know, I didn't get the supervision I needed or whatever. And then you would be able to say, actually, here are the dates on which we met. We met for an hour each time, and here are my notes of those supervisions. So in my opinion, it's very, very good practice to keep some kind of record of the process of supervision. Michael Rhodes, are you wanting to make a contribution? I don't understand your note. Michael, yeah. Michael
Oh, sorry,
McLennan.
I was just, oh, sorry.
That's okay. Michael McLennan.
Thank you. Sorry, Craig. So just to say, in Appendix 3 of the Code of Practice Handbook for postgraduate supervision, there's a template form that has to be filled in after every supervision.
Oh, okay.
And it has to be signed by the supervisor and by the student as a record of the meeting.
Okay.
It's
So
very,
there-
very helpful. And so basically over time, we expect a whole series of those documents to be recorded. So and that's an absolute requirement. And it just means that if there is a problem, we have the paper trail.
Excellent. Okay, so there you've got your record of notes and a way of doing it. And, you know, my advice would be do that at the end of the supervision or immediately after it. Don't delay, you know, and I don't think one has to write an essay. It's just a record of the supervision. So, yeah. Okay, that's really great. And then just, you know, a comment about when writing comes in. So obviously we review it carefully. And what I tend to do with electronic medium nowadays, I have a Dropbox folder for each of my doctoral students. So everything I get from them, I put into the Dropbox folder, or whatever other method you have of keeping their materials. And then I insert comments throughout the document. And then I also provide them with a list of general comments. And then I try and get that to them in good time before we meet, so they have an opportunity to review it, and then we can discuss it when we meet. So, you know, these are all fairly basic things. The other thing I should just tell you, that if you have a look at UTC's documentation, you will find their criteria for when the doctorate is examined. Okay, and I've examined doctorates now, I think in about 6 or 7 countries around the world. And there's only one I've ever examined where there were no criteria. And it was very, very, very difficult. And it's extremely important, in my opinion, to have these criteria. And what I do is when the student starts, I encourage them to look at the criteria. When they're heading into the final submission, I encourage them to look again at the criteria. Because when the examiners write their reports, they will write them on the basis of the criteria. So you can then look at the criteria and say, does my work meet that? Does my work meet that? Does my work meet that? Okay, so you can almost write your own report, as it were, for the doctorate before you submit it. But it's really, really valuable for the student and the supervisor to be aware of the criteria. Sometimes I flag that right at the beginning of the whole process, flag it during the process. but flag it very strongly at the end of the process. So these criteria are invaluable, and they're often the only way of securing a type of objectivity in the examination. Yeah. Okay, and then, so not much more, and so we can stop earlier if we need to. So, you know, a thing about a writing timeline, these are things to discuss with students. If a student was working with me full-time, I would expect a major chapter, something like 15 to 20,000 words once every 3 months. If they are part-time, maybe once every 6 months, but you know, you do want to be meeting with students. So one can divide up a chapter into parts, as it were, and however. But the one thing is to watch is that the writing is progressing. Okay, so you really do want to flag up very quickly if suddenly a situation emerges where you're not hearing from the student, no writing is coming in, and this carries on, and it does happen. Okay, so so one wants to keep an eye on the fact that the process is underway, and if it's not, then the student should alert you or whatever. And then I've mentioned this, just keeping an eye on the clock so that, you know, one can map this thing out fairly clearly. And once one's got past the upgrade, the good news is basically the student has to write the rest of the chapters, finalize the dissertation, and submit it. 90,000 word maximum, including footnotes, but not bibliography and appendices. This is not something that is not doable. It's eminently doable, is what I try and encourage my students to see. They've now got the whole thing mapped out fairly clearly. So then it's a matter of doing it. Then just a comment. I do encourage my students to find dialogue partners in their research area. And some of my best students have done this in truly spectacular fashion. So I had a student working on anthropology and Soren Kierkegaard in dialogue with French Catholic phenomenology. And this student found herself to the Hong Library in America, which is kind of the Kierkegaard Center for Kierkegaard scholarship in the world. She was also a visiting scholar at the Gregorian in Rome. She is fluent in Italian. She was asked to translate work on Kierkegaard into English. But through her time at the Hong Library, she met every major Kierkegaard scholar because they tend to go through the Hong Library. She also attended the meetings of the Kierkegaard Society and so on and so forth. So this is stuff that we really want to encourage, is that, you know, there's a big world of scholarship out there. And so if your student is working in an area, they need to know, are there societies and journals and other things where I can get into that community and really, you know, iron sharpens iron. Now, I just want to put one caveat on this, though. There are some doctoral students who think that the best thing to do is to send their writing to every prominent scholar in their area. Now, you'll be amazed how many scholars actually go along with that. I would not. But I would strongly discourage my students from doing that. Okay, but you do get doctoral students who think all these scholars out there, and you know, it's kind of nice in a strange way that all these scholars out there are just waiting for their chapters to roll into their inboxes. Okay, now my advice to my students would be, that's the role of the supervisors. Okay, and I would discourage it. I mean, I just don't think it's good practice. but it does happen. So find the dialogue partners, learn from these other scholars, present papers on your work, okay? But I would discourage my students from sending their chapters all over the place. And in my experience, if you have a student like that, there's a bit of hubris involved. And then the next thing is they think actually these other scholars are a better supervisor than their own supervisor. Now that may well be the case. I mean, who knows? Except when push comes to shove and they're preparing for the upgrade or preparing to submit, it's not these other great scholars who do the hard work, it's the supervisor who does the hard work. So these are things just to watch, to be aware of the person that you're working with. They're all individuals. Encourage them to find the dialogue partners. I would discourage sending the work out with the hope that all these great luminaries can't wait to read it and comment on it. Okay. And then my hope is that our community at the Kirby Lang Center and Union will provide communities of dialogue partners. So we want to be alerting our students. You know, my hope is that we can think of perhaps something like a regular seminar for our doctoral students and our supervisors, maybe once every 2 months or something like that. You know, just in my own research, what I'm finding is the events that the Kirby Lang Center has our best events are feeding straight into my research. So last year we did a spectacular event with Leon Kass, the Jewish bioethicist, just after his massive new commentary on Exodus came out. And I mean, Dave has got something coming out in the big picture, which feeds straight out of that. I find that is circled into my forthcoming publications and so on and so forth. So, you know, I've been thinking recently, and Dave, you may have ideas on this, you know, what can we do that will keep sparking in that way? You know, so one idea of mine was because, who is the guy at Praxis, Dave? Andy Crouch. Andy Crouch's new book has just come out, but we had a meeting with Andy Crouch recently, and he made the very perceptive comment that in the drama of scripture, we never discuss Ruth. So I said to him, Andy, have you got the first edition in front of you? So he said, yes. And I said, what's on the cover? So the cover image that Baker put on it is of a scene from Ruth, but we never discuss Ruth in the drama of scripture. So a wonderful sort of serendipity. But Andy was arguing that Ruth is the most important book in the Bible for a Christian understanding of economics. Leon Kass has recently published a commentary on Ruth with someone else. So here was my thought, you know, would you guys be interested if we said, okay, in 6 weeks' time, we're going to set aside 2 or 3 hours and we'll just go at the book of Ruth from our own perspectives? Well, thank you for the overwhelming response. You know, what I would be looking forward to is the mathematical, physical perspective from Mikhail.
I have it in preparation, Craig. I can send it to you if you want.
No, Mikhail, I still have to read your doctorate, and that's hard enough. Okay, anyway, you know, Leon Kass has said he's willing to do more events with us if we want them. So, you know, I think we have to find the balance between what's doable amidst all our responsibilities. But personally, I would just love to say that we're going to have a 3-hour seminar and Andrew will do 5 minutes on a missional approach. Someone else will do 5 minutes, only 5 minutes. Dave will do 5 minutes on Ruth and Judges, because, you know, that's just obvious. You know, Rob will do the economics because I want to know why is this book so significant for economics. There's also a very interesting relationship between Ruth and Deuteronomy. There's maybe John would be willing to do something on Ruth and the Gospels, because I think it does come up there. Brian, yeah, the patristic reception. Oh my goodness, only 5 minutes, Brian. But no, so so you don't have to respond to this, but let us know what you think. And we wouldn't be asking people to come having done hours of preparation. We would ask them to come, with their initial thoughts, and then we would just go at it together for an hour or so, discussing something like that. But I think that could be just incredibly, personally, it would be the kind of stuff that I wouldn't want to miss. And that's what we want to. And so we want to.
Can I enter that?
You can.
Is it feasible at all for KLC to do what some institutions do, and that is organize or arrange a colloquium in which the students themselves present where they're at in their research project? It would have to go over 3 or 4 days probably, or depending on how many students there are, in which other students and supervisors all have the right to give their opinion on what they're listening to. Is that a feasible proposition? What do you think?
Yeah, well, 100%, and it's actually already in the pipeline. So you will see we're soon to go live with our pages on how the Kirby Lang Center will manage the Bible Society funding for research. So this is a fund that supports research students in England and Wales, up to 5,000 a year. And our pages are very close to going live. One of the conditions of our partnership with Bible Society is that we have a conference each year at which students who receive support from Bible Society present where they are in their research. So, and just incidentally, the first such day, if you're interested and want to put it in your diary, will be on the 1st of July this year. It's a Friday.
A one-day session?
Well, what we really want at the Kirby Lang Center, but we need to think about this to discuss with our partners, we really want to have an annual summer conference that is the must-attend conference.
Yeah.
So the École Biblique in Jerusalem has asked to partner with us in a day event, so that would be part of it, which we're very excited about. There would be space for the doctoral students, ours and potentially others, to present the results of their work. And then we would also be looking for members of our community to present papers at such an event, and then, but we want to do it, as is typical of the Kirby Lang Center, in the context of liturgy, with a very strong communal dimension, and perhaps with the arts or music involved in the evenings, something like that, So, but
I understand that in my experience, the colloquium are obligatory for students. Yeah.
Well, certainly for those who receive funding from Bible Society, it's a requirement. And then I think Kirby Lang Center and UTC would have to, so UTC have a conference on Luther coming up, which several of the Kirby Lang's people are speaking at in September. So we would just need to get these things coordinated. One possibility for the Kirby Lang Center is to say to Union, we'll have this 1 year in Cambridge and 1 year in Belfast. But this is where the negotiations or the discussion, because the one thing we really want at the Kirby Lang Center, we want all of us to be appearing in Belfast sooner or later. So we get to know them, know their place, know the people. So we really are building community. On the other hand, Cambridge is not too shabby as a destination. So we would also like to have people. And at Margaret Beaufort, we have a phenomenal, very large boardroom with big screen internet connection. So this means we can host a face-to-face event, but also people can come in virtually from around the world. It's what we call now a blended approach. So, and you know, travel is not always an easy thing. So if people can't or don't want to travel, they can come in virtually to such an event. And you know, just recently, Richard Balcom sent out his letter that he sends to all his friends and that. And I learned that he's finishing off a 2-volume work on the Son of Man. So I want to ask Richard, you know, would he consider giving us a briefing? I mean, I really want to know what's in those 2 volumes, especially if I don't have to read those 2 volumes to find out, you know. But that's the kind of thing we want. I mean, Richard is one of our best New Testament scholars in the world. He's part of the Kirby Lang Center. He's in Cambridge. Let's have Richard in. Give us a briefing on his current scholarship on Son of Man. You know, and then, I mean, immediately I want to know from Brian, how is Son of Man picked up amongst the patristics? And, you know, you can just see how this thing could generate enormous and then, I mean, the missiological dimension is just so important in all that we're doing, you know. So, yeah, there's the Luther Conference. Okay, you know, that's it from me. So unless there are any comments or questions, I'll ask Mike Wagaman to close in prayer for us. But are there any
I have another comment or question, actually, a question going back some way about the writing up process. What is the principles by which we work when a person writes in a language, in the English language, which is not their first language? How much expertise in the language, English language, is one expected to consider? I've had Korean students, for example, who will have passed all the exams that they need to pass in English proficiency. But when it comes to writing English, sometimes they're all over the place. And finding somebody who will try and put their English as it should be, that is to say, somebody who is an English speaker, doesn't always work very well. So my question is, you know, do we allow a certain latitude in the use of English as long as it can be fully understood by the examiners?
Yeah, so I'll make a comment or two, and then Michael McLennan may have some. So you will have seen the minimal requirements for access to the program, which clearly set out the English requirements. You know, I do think this is something. So just another thing, there was a time in the West where all our theological seminaries were full of Koreans. That is not the case anymore. And one reason is they're doing it all themselves in Korea. So, but nevertheless, you know, we already are attracting students who English is their second language. And so I'll tell you what I would suggest that we do on this. There are the minimum requirements, but as Andrew has pointed out, a student can meet those and still not actually be up to the task. So I think that's where the writing that is submitted, we need to pay very close attention to that. In conversation with a person, you will soon pick up, I think, how capable they are in English. And I think my reproach would be, if we have doubts, is to suggest to a student that they do 6 months of immersion or something like that, because it is you know, Korean is a very different language to English, as are some of these. Are very hard. I mean, I know when I went to Korea, to learn a few words was just extraordinarily difficult. But if they're doing a doctorate in English at a British institution, then the standards are the standards. You know, so I would say we help them by getting their English to the highest possible level. It will benefit the rest of their career. Michael, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I would just add, Craig, that the entry requirements are not low. They're pretty high on English. The scores that are required are really very high. They're higher than many institutions. And they're also required to submit a writing sample as part of the application, which indicates that this is not something they're allowed to just pick up during the PhD program. It has to be in place. And it certainly can't be the case that supervisors write the PhD for someone, which is known to happen and isn't acceptable.
Okay, any final comments or questions?
Could we get just a little brief overview of the cost of the program to the prospective students, the expectations that they have within the program of travel to UTC or to KLC, and if there's language requirements, you know, what funding is available to them for doing immersive kinds of languages or immersion in language, or to travel to conferences. I ask, as doctoral students in the United States have access to various funding sources to be able to either reimburse them for travel to conferences or to pay them up front. Anyway, but if we could get just some sense of the cost and the resources available, and if that could be included in the presentation next week, or maybe just in a document we get, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, okay, no, that's a very, very good question. And I think we have some good answers to most of those questions. So we'll put that on the agenda for next week. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for the link. So Brian, just what we'll brief you on next time is the agreement between the Kirby Lang Center and Union that bears on some of those questions. So yeah. Okay, unless there's anything else, I will close in prayer, and thank you so much for your time. It's lovely to see you, and wish you a great rest of the day and a good weekend.